those shots speak for themselves. But long story short, I've rediscovered an incredibly atmospheric low fantasy show from the 80s that largely seems forgotten today despite its stellar reputation among its fans. Ladies and gentlemen, I present you Robin of Sherwood. While it was very much before my time, George Orwell jokes aside, 1984 was a year that had a strong influence on my development. Just looking at music releases, 1984 gave birth to some albums that I would consider essential to the metal scene. Metallica's Ride the Lightning, Bathory's self-titled album, Celtic Frost's Morbid Tales, among others. 1984 was also the year Robin of Sherwood first started airing, and it was a show that was always somewhere there in the background throughout my life, yet I kept ignoring it. I just recently caved in and decided to watch it for myself and see what the deal is, and my jaw was floored the entire time. It was exactly my vibe, so I want to share it with you here as well. There have been a lot of interpretations of the Robin Hood's legend, so I won't even attempt to compare Robin of Sherwood to its successors or predecessors. With it being quite an overused story, a lot of them honestly don't even seem that good. I mean, I would be walking the streets, see yet another poster for a Robin Hood film, and think, what the hell is that even? It doesn't look even vaguely historical. So yeah. For once, I'm choosing to save my time and sanity and skip all the slop. The legend of Robin Hood needs no introduction. It's a story about a group of Englishmen outlaws hiding in the Sherwood forest that steal from the rich and give to the poor. So it's how the legend is told that matters. It's very nice that Robin of Sherwood had writers that actually cared about history, so the show was immersive and rooted in historical realism. It was shot mostly on site, didn't have crazy special effects, and it felt genuinely believable due to those things. What was somewhat unusual about the show is the incorporation of mysticism and light fantasy elements. Now, the more modern productions of Robin Hood could also be considered to include light fantasy elements instead of being just historically inaccurate, but this case is different. Robin of Sherwood was still realistic in most of its aspects, and the mystical elements were rooted in beliefs people might have had back in medieval days. Robin, his gang, and many villagers in the show are in tune with nature and in turn, paganism. The pagan elements come from various myths and superstitions, but in the show, they have physical manifestations. Some of the villains lean into the occult and even Satanism, and I'm very much into all those ideas. In fact, all of the faiths, including Christianity, seem to have some supernatural effects in the show. There is even Jewish magic?
No! No! Keep away from me.
Sir, what did he see in the book that made him go mad?
His own wickedness?
What the inclusion of mysticism does is it intertwines the already fairy tale-like legend of Robin with various other myths into a single monolith. And I would say that the inclusion of paganism, occultism, and Satanism really leads to some impressive imagery that only enriches the medieval setting and makes it seem more mystical. It's a manifestation of all the phenomena medieval people couldn't yet explain, and it's an aspect that elevates a simple historical story into a folk legend. I must say, the main cast is wonderfully picked, and you can really sense the brotherhood between the characters. First, of course, we have Robin Hood, or Robin of Locksley, portrayed by Michael Pride. Even by today's standards, I must say, this guy is quite the heartthrob. I mean, just look at that IMDb profile photo. To me, he felt a bit like a Dale Cooper kind of character, except on the opposite side of the law, with the way how he would be very kind-natured and would be led in this quest by mystical dreams and visions. Aside from other things, he acts as the glue tying the band of outlaws together. His second in command, and probably my favorite character, is Little John, performed by Clive Mantle. a giant of a man with an equally large heart. He always feels like such a nice guy to be friends with. I absolutely loved his introduction in the show. In the first episode he was straight up possessed by some satanic spell, so Robin had to defeat him in combat and remove the pentagram from his chest to undo the spell. Little John was definitely not a Satanist you would want to come across. Naturally, Robin's love interest is Maid Marian, played by Judith Roth, and I couldn't imagine a more perfect casting. When I think Lady Marian, that's exactly how I want her to look like. And in this show, she's not just a fair damsel, but a proper member of the gang. She would stay in the woods and shoot longbows with the rest of the merry men. Will Scarlet, performed by Ray Winstone, is pretty much the skeptical and selfish counterweight to Robin's idealism. He would often question Robin's choices and even his position as a leader, but he would still stick with the gang in the end, and his character would add that believability that this is an actual gang of outlaws. It's pretty amusing how Ray Winstone based this character's performance on football hooligans. Another classic member of the Merry Men is Friar Tuck, depicted by Phil Rose, a mostly comical character, but also a ray of intelligence within the gang. This specific depiction would make it interesting how a former Christian monk would not only side with outlaws, but also pagans. On a bit of a different note, there is an unexpected but much liked character in the gang, an Arabic assassin Nazir, played by Mark Ryan. He would be the strong silent type, a no-nonsense fighter. Funnily enough, he was supposed to die in the second episode as a minor antagonist. He could have just killed Robin, but went, nah, and just joined him instead. The decision to keep him was made on the spot simply because everyone liked him, and he did end up as quite an iconic character. And lastly there's Much, portrayed by Peter Llewellyn Williams, a miller's son who's a little slow, but his heart is in the right place. The band of merry men would be full of very different characters, and they would often bicker, laugh at each other's expense, yet they would still feel like the best of friends who can trust each other with their lives. The actors seem to have a great dynamic between one another outside of the filming set, and it definitely showed in their performances. On the opposite side of the barricades there's the Sheriff of Nottingham, played by Nicholas Grace. Quite a comical, over-the-top villain that's always entertaining to see fail. A completely immoral person that would use any means necessary to reach his goals and would go ballistic at any inconvenience. His main goon, no, not that kind of goon, is Sir Guy of Gisborne, depicted by Robert Addy, the chief of military. He would be the guy who would have to fulfill all of the sheriff's whims, while the sheriff would take all the praise for his accomplishments, yet he would be at fault if the sheriff's plans failed. That's the main cast you're going to see in every episode, but there would be quite a few cameos on minor characters. Some of the standouts for me are Herne the Hunter, played by John Abineri, a mystical shaman-like character that leads Robin Hood. He would be very mysterious and have this almost godlike status. He wouldn't actually do that much, but just his presence alone really elevates the show. And Baron Simon de Bellem, played by Anthony Valentine. He's the stern sorcerer of the dark arts. He's the one who possessed Little John and had Nazir at his aid. He would be adorned with a pentagram necklace and would keep doing occult spells. He was an amazing villain to set the tone of the show. While the show has continuity, it's mostly episodic, with each episode being a fairly self-contained story. While I generally prefer shows with more continuous stories, I must admit that Robin of Sherwood has plenty of fun moments. The intro sequence is quite iconic, especially with the theme song by Clannad. Just look at that janky zoom. Of course there is the classic mandatory arrow splitting shot. I found it quite entertaining how they would keep throwing guards off high walls. It's quite a simple thing that isn't explicitly violent looking, but it just feels so satisfying. Oh, and look at this random little devil. While the gang would generally fight the Sheriff of Nottingham throughout the show, there would be a lot of one-off villains and some of them could get quite interesting. There could be some murderous mercenaries, or I quite like these Templars that were back from the Crusades. It was quite a rare thing, at least back in the day, to have Christians depicted as the villains in favor of pagans. And I love the whole pagan theme so much. Maybe it's because we Lithuanians were Europe's last pagans, but I find these ancient rituals very interesting and the whole worldview that's very in tune with nature appealing. And there would be quite a lot of pagan imagery in the show. Robin and Marion would have a pagan wedding, there would be feasts for pagan deities, all sorts of mystical stone circles would be prominent throughout the show. This, again, ties into the magical and the occult elements of the show. There was this really cool fight against Baron de Belem, who was straight up a sorcerer. The guy would use pentagrams to hex people and all sorts of other spells. There would be multiple possessions in the show, turning some of the merry men into violent, mindless husks. Due to all this stuff, Robin of Sherwood got the attention of the satanic panic movement, even though the violence in the show was fairly mild to comply with the broadcast requirements, and the pagan stuff was never satanic to begin with. I guess they did make a bunch of nuns out to be a satanic cult, but those characters would be the villains, so it's just typical fear-mongering. Before I get into some more specific things about the show, I have to get into slight spoiler territory. And there's no way to just isolate the spoiler section, because then I wouldn't be able to show or talk about half of the entire series. While I'm making this video with the intention to attract new, younger viewers like myself to the show, you had 40 years to watch it already. Besides, if you look up any articles or discussions about the show, you'll immediately run into this thing I'm thinking about. Even looking at the promotional images or DVD covers might spoil the surprise. I mean, who's that guy? That's Robin, that's the other guys, but who's that constantly next to Robin? Well, that's also Robin. Robin Hood. Robin of Sherwood. Yep, there's two of them. There was a main actor switch between seasons 2 and 3, and it was quite controversial. The modern day equivalent would be Henry Cavill being replaced by Liam Hemsworth as the Witcher. Well, I personally was never a huge fan of actual Superman being Geralt, as the character is supposed to be a little ugly. The Polish Hexter was more fitting in my opinion, but that's beside the point. Cavill, same as Michael Pratt as Robin, was already iconic and very much liked by the audience. Replacing the main actor is a sure way to cause some outrage. On top of that, this hunk of a man was replaced by some twink.
Who are you?
Robin of Huntingdon!
Robin of Huntingdon?
Robert! Herm's son!
I'm the Archbishop of Canterbury!
Now, I knew that Robin was going to get replaced prior to properly watching the show, and I was fully prepared to hate that replacement, but to my surprise, the show handled the switch surprisingly gracefully. I don't know how they did that in The Witcher, since I just stopped watching that show, but I assumed they just unceremoniously replaced the actor without any explanation, and I expected the same to happen here, but no. Michael Pratt had decided that he wanted to seek some different career opportunities and leave the show, so it was made so that his Robin would die at the end of the second season. While that wasn't originally intended, it was a very powerful episode that really tugs the heartstrings. In the third season, the new Robin is a completely different person, both as an actor and as the character. Instead of a common villager Robin of Locksley, it's Robert of Huntingdon, a noble, played by Jason Connery, Sean Connery's son. It's actually quite clever, because it makes the show utilize the different interpretations of Robin's origin, and by there being multiple Robin Hoods, the whole concept of Robin Hood becomes less of a single character and more of this folk legend, a symbol of resistance against the oppressors, where any outlaw could become Robin Hood. And look, they even remade a janky zoom for the new intro. After the original Robin's death, I would have expected Will Scarlet to take the leader's role, as he was constantly competing with Robin, but I guess he just didn't have that glue to keep the band together. The merry men had split up, and Robert was the one who went out to prove himself to every single one of them, as well as the viewers, and got the band back together to fight against injustice. And while I still think Michael Pratt was the more likable Robin Hood, I wouldn't say that Jason was that much worse of an actor. There were aspects I liked a bit more with the new Robin, in fact. For example, I felt like the romance between Robin of Locksley and Lady Marian was quite rushed, with them meeting for the first time in the first episode and getting married by the end of the second one. With Robert, the romance was a lot slower since Marian was still mourning her husband, and it felt more believable that way. Plus, it allowed for more development throughout the season of them slowly falling in love and making small advances. I would have been alright if they ditched the romance with the second Robin altogether, but I guess Marian just has a type. Meanwhile, Michael Pratt ditched his role as Robin and went to do The Three Musketeers on Broadway. The show apparently bombed, which ended up hurting his career and self-confidence. And it's a shame, because it felt like he had the potential to become quite a cinema star with his looks and charisma. Now that we've got that out of the way, I want to talk about the execution of the show. I must say that Robin of Sherwood feels very immersive. When watching, I would feel like I could actually be there, whether in the actual Middle Ages or the filming set. The lack of CG really helps in this case, because most scenes are filmed in real historical buildings in England and the surrounding forests. The crew paid extra attention to historical accuracy and details, and scouted out forests without fir trees, so they would be accurate to the forests of that period. The outfits are a little debatable though. I'm not quite the history nerd to point out every little historical inaccuracy, but I'm definitely an enthusiast when it comes to ancient and medieval outfits and armor. At the same time, I'm no stranger to fantasy, but even when it comes to that, most of the time I prefer equipment that's not necessarily historically accurate, but at least historically plausible. I can appreciate some artistic embellishments, but I think it's so much cooler when the weapons and armor look like they could actually exist and be practical too. The outfits in Robin of Sherwood are mostly believable, but there is definitely stuff that falls under that historically inaccurate but plausible territory. Most villagers, random extras, soldiers, and most characters overall are perfectly fine depictions in my opinion, and I can easily believe that they could have existed back in the day. But then there are some outfits that have some fairly common misconceptions. For example, Nazir's outfit. I'm not even going to comment on his initial black armor, not sure what's even going on with that, but when he joins Robin, he wears this jacket with metal studs. It's not outside of what could have been made back in the day, but these kinds of jackets did not really exist. It's a frequent misinterpretation of brigandine armor. With medieval illustrations being pretty crude, misinterpretations are forgivable, but brigandine armor would be actual metal armor made out of many small plates and riveted under a layer of fabric, so it might seem like it's just fabric jacket with studs, while it isn't. In the second season, Robin had attached some random pieces of chainmail to his outfit, which was just kinda weird. I've seen some occasions of ringmail as well. There would be some higher-ranking soldiers wearing ringmail. Not chainmail, but the sort of armor that has rings attached on top of a fabric jacket. I could see how that would reduce slashing damage, and it is possible to make. But there is no archaeological evidence that such armor existed, and it might be yet another misinterpretation of an illustration, because chainmail is just difficult to draw. What stuck out to me is that Robert had pieces of ringmail attached to his vest, and that's definitely more of an artistic liberty than anything realistic. While it's not 100% historically accurate, it's still believable enough not to break immersion. It's nowhere as bad as the infamous scrotum armor from the Netflix's Witcher. There are no crazy embellishments or modernizations of the medieval outfits. It's far from the fashion show of Vikings pretending to be historical. I actually like that show regardless, at least the first few seasons, but I lost interest in it later on. Also, funny thing, my parents used to have a really low quality copy of the show, and watching that I actually thought the soldiers were wearing grey sweaters and pretending they're chainmail, but no, it's actual proper chainmail. Good stuff. Overall, it gives me a bit of a feel of the old school fantasy style before it turned into mostly Warhammer lookalikes. Think video games like Might and Magic 6, with the FMV actors dressed in medieval clothing, or Gothic. Stuff that's fantasy, but within believable levels. It's mostly historical stuff, but it just has a dash of that classic swords and sorcery style. There is that one duel with Japanese katanas that came out of the left field though. That was really odd. As if curved sabers weren't exotic enough for Arabic characters. I mean, curved sabers and the inclusion of some Arabic characters makes enough sense when the show takes place during the Crusades, so the different cultures would meet each other, but they would not have Japanese katanas. I loved the overall production and the look of the show. I don't recall doing this with any other show I watched, but I would keep pausing Robin of Sherwood to take screenshots just because it looked so nice. I don't want to come off snobby and say that old equals good. There are moments that look dated for sure, but the approach to filmmaking used to be quite different to what we see these days. The indoor shots would be quite dark and moody. They would have very deliberate lighting from torches, candles and windows. The outdoor shots would just use natural light from the English overcast skies, and without any fancy color grading that would be used in modern productions, it just feels so much more raw and lifelike. There would be shots that would feel a little underexposed, a little too dark, but it would still contribute to the gritty feel. The locations chosen for the show are absolutely beautiful, especially the historical castles and monasteries. Smoke machines would be utilized wonderfully. Some shots would have these gradient filters on top of the actual camera lenses, from what I can tell, and they would look absolutely magical. The Swords of Vale and Ark especially have some shots that are stunning to this day, with these horsemen, the Hounds of Lucifer, riding through blood-red skies with their cloaks flowing. This is the stuff that pretty much inspired Peter Jackson's Nazguls in The Lord of the Rings. I even enjoyed the little technical things from the film equipment of those times. Some brighter lights would have the halation effect, these colored glowing edges around the white light. Or there would be this subtle bloom of light shining through the trees. People now try to recreate these effects for digital footage on purpose, to imitate these old cameras using all sorts of post-processing. Maybe we could have gotten something similar out of the Polish Hexer series if it had a larger budget. The scenes shot in historical castles were great. It's just a shame that in the end we've got stuff like the Golden Dragon. I have very few complaints when it comes to the presentation. The show utilized practical effects for the most part, but the few moments that utilized CG did not age that well. Due to the TV restrictions, the show was not allowed to display blood, dismemberment, or any more serious injuries in fights. It mostly had to just be implied, and that detracts a bit from the realism.
Because it was for children, we were never allowed to show penetration, if I may use that.
The actors would mostly do their own fighting instead of using stuntmen, and that's definitely cool, but it would show that it's not really seasoned veterans fighting, especially when it comes to the soldiers. The fights are generally serviceable, but there are some that would look straight up goofy. That, and some of the deliveries from the actors, make it feel a bit like a stage play more than real life, but in a way that in itself has some charm. The show would have a considerable budget and could afford many takes. There's plenty of outtakes to confirm that, but I would still notice some little mistakes that would make it into the final cut. Stuff like someone's helmet falling off or some prop sword breaking somewhere, but these are very minor things and it's stuff that could still have actually happened. Life is not perfect. Occasionally there would be a piece of dirt stuck to the camera lens. There would be a few scenes where the actors had to redub their lines, and that would be quite noticeable, but at least there's not too many of them.
Bits! You rot! Bits fall off! I got it for sure I'll kill myself! We might be lucky. Lucky? You might be lucky, not me!
Speaking of the presentation, there's no way I can skip the soundtrack discussion. The soundtrack of Robin of Sherwood is so memorable it's otherworldly. I recall back when I was a kid my parents were re-watching the show, and while I wasn't paying attention to it back then, especially since it was dubbed in a language I didn't understand, I did hear the music in the background, and just that was enough for me to memorize it by heart. It is composed by the Irish band Clannad, and it incorporates some acoustic Celtic instrumentals as well as some ethereal synths and vocals. The intro theme, Robin the Hooded Man, is an absolute anthem. It would create such hype whenever the intro played. It would be a shame to skip it. Together We is so soft and ethereal, I'd say it easily rivals even the Twin Peaks intro theme. There is the more percussive battle theme that is also unmistakable with anything else. And just about every track they made for the original series, that first season, is 10 out of 10. Very well composed, executed and memorable. Most of these tracks were released on the 1984 album Legend. I find it a little interesting that it's not explicitly marketed as the Robin of Sherwood soundtrack and has an original title instead, but it does absolutely hold up on its own without the context of the show. That stuff is so good it frequently rings at my home on vinyl. The sound of that album fits this show perfectly. The Celtic folk melodies are perfect for a show about medieval England. I personally absolutely prefer a smaller band playing folk music rather than having an epic orchestra, because it feels like it has a lot more character, when orchestras, while sounding professional, tend to feel a little generic. At parts, it feels like the kind of music actual minstrels within the medieval setting could play. At the same time, the music uses some soft, airy synths, which add the sense of mystique and nostalgia, and I think it meshes well with the romanticized aspects of the show, the mystical fantasy elements and whatnot. The vocals are absolutely stunning and mesmerizing, and vocals overall are rare for soundtracks. As the series continued, the added audio snippets got a little weaker in my opinion, with them being more synth-based instead of medieval sounding instrumentations. Especially in the third season, there would be some distinctly 80s sounding percussion that aged immediately and was a bit distracting. Other than that, the soundtrack is absolutely perfect and timeless. As I looked into it deeper, this whole show seemed like the perfect storm of just the right people getting together. The actors, writers, producers, directors, musicians and the rest of the crew were just the right people for the project. The actors are pretty obvious, each one of them fit their role wonderfully. The fact that they got Clannad to do the soundtrack was a godsend, because it really enriched the show. The original script by Richard Carpenter had some great ideas, and it showed that it's coming from a person that does care about history. There were some interesting cameos from more famous actors too. The one that stood out to me was John Rhys Davies as King Richard the Lionheart. He kept feeling familiar, but I just couldn't place where from, especially without the huge beard. But that's my man Gimli from Lord of the Rings. I even have a figurine of him. There were some things about the production that left me wondering, so I ended up watching all sorts of interviews and behind the scenes footage. Most of the episodes of the show also have commentary tracks narrated by various actors and members of the production crew. There definitely are some pearls in those commentaries.
I have to say I was never particularly fond of that prop.
It wasn't a brilliant.
Looked like a sort of medieval dildo.
It made me appreciate the lesser sung heroes of the show. The writers are mentioned in every intro, but the directors and producers also left a huge impact. It even made me appreciate the technical crew, the cameramen, prop masters, stunt coordinators and so on. There was one main question that was nagging me. A lot of the viewer base tends to say that the third season was a little weaker, and they mostly attribute that to the change of the main character. I ended up liking the new Robin to my own surprise, but the third season felt weaker to me for some different reasons.
Come back!
Do something! Stop them!
Since there were more episodes in this one, it had a few extra script writers, and while some of these episodes hold up well on their own, they don't contribute that much to the continuity. What stood out to me more is that it just felt like it lost some of that immaculate visual quality. Generally, the visuals got brighter and colder. It felt like in some ways they were filmed more technically correct, with no more underexposed shots in the forests, but it also felt like it had this weird green or teal tint that made things feel a tiny bit cold and sickly. The indoor shots also got a fair amount brighter, losing that dark and moody quality I like so much. Throughout the show, I noticed that I mostly stopped taking screenshots because the shots no longer surprised me in their execution. So I wondered, why was that? Unfortunately, there was no commentary track for the last episode of season 2, and the commentary of the third season was done mostly by the actors, not the directors or producers, so it was hard to tell what exactly changed between the two seasons. My first thought was the change in directors. The first season was directed entirely by Ian Sharp, and he did a magnificent job. According to the interviews, he would even contribute to the script. For example, he came up with the whole introductory scene about Robin's father. Ian did not only create a great look and feel for the show, he pretty much created the template for the series. There were a few different directors for season 2, and most notably of them, Robert Young has done some magnificent work. Maybe even better than Ian Sharp. In my opinion, he was responsible for some of the most visually impressive episodes in the whole show, like The Swords of Wayland or The Greatest Enemy, the super impactful episode where the original Robin dies. There were even more different directors in season 3, but Robert Young came back for some of them, so it makes me think that it's not necessarily the directors that are the issue. There were some really interesting episodes by the less frequent directors. For example, this one about a haunted village that straight up felt like a medieval version of an X-Files story. So there's only one big factor left that I can think of. Both Ian Sharp and Robert Young praised the original producer, Paul Knight, because he would give them absolute artistic freedom to attempt any crazy shots and artistic solutions that they wanted. It was a producer that wanted to make the show stand out no matter what. Paul Knight was also the guy that would keep visiting Planet to coordinate the soundtrack, so props for that too. Estad Shargham took over as the main producer of season 3, so maybe that was the reason for the slightly different look. Although I don't want to pile the criticism on just a single person, especially if I'm not correct about this. It's not like season 3 looks straight up bad or anything. With time I got used to the look, it's just now that I'm working on this video and I'm looking at the episodes from different seasons back to back, there is definitely a visible difference. Still, this visual stuff is debatable, and I'm still very glad that the show exists in the way it does. Every aspect of it shows that everyone involved really cared about what they were making. What is an absolute shame, however, is that the show was supposed to have a final 4th season, and it never got funded, so the show doesn't quite have a proper conclusion, and there are some unresolved plot threads. So as it is, I would say the first 2 seasons are a great watch, and the end of the 2nd season can be a strong stopping point. It's sad, but it's very impactful. And the season 3 is there if you're left yearning for more and don't mind a slight dip in quality. And I know I might seem like I'm nitpicking all the tiny flaws in the series, but don't get me wrong. I don't want to make the show seem bad. I'm only doing it because it got me really invested in it, and I care about it a great deal. It feels like I've discovered a lightning in a bottle, so it makes me wish it was as perfect as possible. After all, Robin of Sherwood appeals to so many of my sensibilities all throughout, whether it's the themes, the visuals, or the music. You know, sitting down and watching the show properly made me realize just how much impact Robin of Sherwood might have actually had on my life. It's a little weird to say as a fairly young person, since the show originally came out long before my time, and the original fans are way older than me. But for me, it's a butterfly effect kind of story. You see, Robin of Sherwood was one of the very few Western television shows that was aired in the Soviet Union. I guess a story about the poor robbing from the rich might have fit the Soviet agenda enough. It wasn't something promoting Western capitalism. That led to both of my parents watching the show when they were kids and leaving a lasting impression on them, as well as giving them some common interest for when they eventually met up. They would both tell stories about how they would play as the Robin Hood's gang with their childhood friends. My dad was an edgy boy right from his youth, just like myself, so he would play as the silent and mysterious Nazir. That's a bit like my generation kids being fans of Sasuke, now that I think of it. My mom would complain about her brothers not letting her play together since she was a girl, arguing that Lady Marion would also shoot from bows. This sort of thing left my parents interested in medieval history, pagan myths and traditions, maybe even partially folk music, and especially folk metal. Skyclad was a band that both of my parents loved, and some of their eerie promo shoots made them look like they could fit in as Robin of Sherwood characters. I know it's a bit of a detour, but Skyclad is such a great and underappreciated band that nearly single-handedly popularized folk metal. Both their instrumentals and lyrics are great. Prince and the Poverty Line is a 10 out of 10 album, with every single track being a banger, and I do not say that lightly. I absolutely love the album cover of Folkemon. I think it made a lasting impact on me since my childhood, and now whenever I doodle, the first thing to draw that comes to my mind is a cat with an eye patch, often playing a guitar or smoking. Or The Answer Machine is a wonderful album among others. Give them a shot if you're at all interested in this kind of music. And all these things that Robin of Sherwood made my parents like, in turn, passed on into things I'm enthusiastic about too. And here I am, making this video now. Robin of Sherwood is partially responsible for the taste in media I have, and it might be somewhat because of it that I've covered such fantasy games as Might and Magic or Diablo in this channel. So, if you're someone that has watched the show before and made it all the way here, thank you, and I hope you found my take on Robin of Sherwood interesting. And if you're a younger person, or just someone who hasn't ever heard of the show, don't let its old age dissuade you from watching it. If you're into fantasy or like stories within a historical medieval setting, Robin of Sherwood is absolutely lovely and worth a watch. It might be old, but I'd say it's executed wonderfully and really holds up to this day. You might see some things that are no longer present in modern productions, and dare I say, the best interpretation of Robin Hood's legend.
Nothing's forgotten. Nothing is ever forgotten.
Thank you so much for watching. If you found the video interesting, consider donating to my Ko-fi page. It helps me keep making these videos. And I'll see you in another one.